Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Jillian Balfour. I'm the Vice President, Academic and Dean here at King's University College. And I would like to welcome you to the 2022 Christopher Perrin Beatty and part-time faculty lectures. We're glad that you are joining us here today, either personally or virtually. It's important, I think, for me to position myself today as a settler, knowing my family has always lived and worked on unceded territories of either the Coast Salish peoples where I was born, the Mohawk peoples where I attended graduate school, with the Métis people of the prairies where I completed my doctorate and where my children were born. Then the territory of the Shinabek north of Toronto where I worked for 17 years. Today I stand on the lands of many nations, including the Anishinabek, Lenawapipak, Haudenosaunee, and Attawandaron peoples. I have a responsibility here today, as do we all, to learn the teachings of all of these nations with regards to justice and accountability. The TRC calls on us to take the work of teaching and learning as a sacred act between nations to ensure access to Indigenous-led education. We are gathered here today to recognize the gifts of our colleagues as educators. First established in 1995 academic year, the King's Excellence in Teaching Award is based on evidence of continued contributions to the academic development of our students. All instructors, full-time or part-time with academic teaching responsibilities at King's, are eligible to be nominated. 2 awards are presented annually. One for the full-time instructor with a minimum of 5 years of teaching experience at King's, and second for a part-time instructor with a minimum of 3 years of teaching experience at King's. Factors considered in selecting the recipients include classroom instruction, academic counseling, mentoring, tutoring, and advising of students, course design and curriculum development, preparation of educational materials, and innovative teaching methods. Now I would like to ask our president, Dr. David Malloy, to come to the podium.
Thank you, Jillian, and good afternoon, everyone. The last several days have been really days of excellence, I think, here at King's. Just yesterday, we celebrated 135 student scholars at our annual Students Award ceremony, which is even more remarkable, I think, because these students have excelled in, I hate to use the word unprecedented, where we should scratch that word from our vocabulary. But it's true, these are unprecedented times, and for individuals to show their excellence in the classroom is really quite remarkable. So that was a tremendous event yesterday, and congratulations again to all of these outstanding undergraduate scholars. Today, we're here to celebrate 2 of their mentors. There are many mentors here at King's, but today we celebrate 2 of our outstanding teaching mentors for the Christopher Perrin Beatty series, Dr. Nigel Joseph and Dr. John Grant. And you'll be hearing more about these individuals and from these individuals in a moment. And what this series represents, and I'm so proud that we have this series and that we have continued this on for so long and will so for the future, is that what we do extremely well here at King's, and we're known globally for this, is outstanding undergraduate teaching. And again, these 2 individuals are fabulous examples of what we take such pride in here at King's. We also take pride in our research. And another exciting announcement and demonstration of excellence is the $1 million that King's has invested into the research agenda here at King's. So we put such tremendous emphasis on our teaching skills, on our teaching quality. This is a demonstration of how much emphasis we place on our research. All of this ties into how we interact with the community. We do so as teachers, as research scholars, and as members of our community to make this this London community, this King's community, a better place. So with that, I will stop here. And my next task is to proudly introduce our next speaker, Marilyn Mason, our Vice President of Enrollment Services and Strategic Partnerships and the chair of the committee that has selected these individuals. And Marilyn, the show is now yours.
Thank you very much, Dave. It really is a pleasure to be here, and I've had the honor of being the chair of the selection committee for the King's University College Teaching and Excellence Award since its inception. And I am thrilled to be here to present to our part-time winner this year, Dr. Nigel Joseph. I've had the pleasure of knowing Dr. Joseph since he came to us in 2005. He is a member of our Department of English, French, and Writing. He's immensely popular and known for the wide range of expertise in both his knowledge and his teaching. He teaches everything from reading popular culture to fourth-year seminars on Woolf, Kafka, or Eliot. And in enrollment services, we know each year there'll be lots of disappointed students who couldn't get into Dr. Joseph's course. His popularity and his respect is well known across the campus. So before we hear Dr. Joseph's lecture on bookish shelves and coordinated publics, I would like to present Dr. Joseph with this year's award. Please join me, Nigel.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Marilyn, for those very kind words. It is a great honor and a pleasure to be here today. My talk is titled Bookish Selves and Coordinated Publics. While teaching a course on different types of selfhood a year ago, I suggested to the students in the course that English departments implicitly promised to develop in students who were sufficiently motivated a certain kind of literary selfhood, a selfhood that was capacious, complex, critical, somewhat detached from the contemporary ethos of materialism and ruthless ambition, somewhat dreamy and possessed of Keatsian negative capability. A selfhood, in fact, that was bookish. Among the heroes of such a bookish self, I further suggested, were Augustine and Montaigne, the first of whom laid out a dialectical relationship with his creator that presupposed interiority and self-reflexivity, while the other suggested that a playful inventory of traces of the self would help one to accept both the strangeness of one's own self and the strangeness of that of others. There was also Milton, who said, intemperately but satisfyingly, "Who kills a man kills a reasonable creature, God's image, but he who destroys a good book kills reason itself, kills the image of God, as it were, in the eye." And there was Lamb and De Quincey and Virginia Woolf. Lamb, he tells us in one of his essays, used to lend his precious books to Coleridge and De Quincey and only mildly begrudged the fact that they were rarely returned. De Quincey filled houses with books, and when he found the clutter intolerable, simply moved to another residence. Virginia Woolf, whose protagonist in A Room of One's Own was denied entrance into the British Museum, where she wanted to read, explored the delicious possibilities of a room of one's own, very possibly as a space for books of one's own. Closer to our time, there was the Black scholar and activist, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who describes the distinctive pleasures of walking into the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University every morning and spending the entire day reading books on Black culture by Black writers, and thereby contributing to the formation of a self that was both reflective and politically active. The course wasn't primarily focused on bookish selves. It was about three kinds of selfhood I thought were important in modern life: narrative, performative, and dialectical selfhoods. Narrative selfhood, as the name suggests, involved a selfhood constructed by imaginatively ordering one's life into a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Performative selfhood drew on Sartre and Goffman to posit a selfhood which was concerned with impression management, with a careful display of oneself and the manipulation of others' opinions. And the most important, dialectical selfhood, was concerned with gaining recognition from others by establishing in their eyes the integrity and full humanity of oneself. Through readings of Frankenstein, Jane Eyre, and essays by Audre Lorde, we explored the way dialectical selfhood remains unavailable to many groups, including women in general, people of color, and people with disabilities. An important component of what I was calling narrative selfhood drew sustenance from books. The novel especially both modeled and encouraged a narrative selfhood which incorporated performance and tended towards a dialectical progression. Sometimes, however, as with the monster in Frankenstein, and Bertha Mason, the Creole wife who is locked in an attic in Jane Eyre, narrative selfhood faltered and failed. Performances were ignored or misinterpreted, and a dialectical resolution was not permitted. Bookish selves and narrative selfhood were valuable, but you had to already possess certain kinds of privilege to truly take advantage of them. The monster in Frankenstein, George Grant usefully reminds us that the word monster comes from the Latin monere, a warning, is the very epitome of a bookish self. He literally creates himself as an intellectual and moral being by reading Plutarch, Milton, and Goethe. But his reading and his good intentions do not endear him to ordinary humans. Appalled by his appearance, his difference, they refuse to recognize him as human and seek to kill him. One of the interesting strands of argument that was generated by this conception of the bookish self was one which emphasized its loss, its deterioration into a simulacrum of its former self under the successive assaults of film and television on the one hand, and an addictive immersion in social media and cell phone connectivity on the other. For many years, I taught a course in popular culture, one component of which was a set of essays that critiqued the effects of film viewing and internet usage on what one of the essayists, Nicholas Carr, called deep reading, where Adorno and Horkheimer, whose essay on the culture industry we also read for the course, had castigated film for dominating us through sensory overload and the speed of on-screen development that incapacitated critical thought, and Hubert Dreyfus, whose essay on the internet was another of the readings for the course, worried that digital teaching would fall disastrously short of the capacity for pedagogic transformation inherent in face-to-face classroom encounters. Carr was concerned about the way the quick scanning and distracted screen viewing of the internet generation would displace old-fashioned print reading itself. I quote, "The kind of deep reading that a sequence of printed pages promotes is valuable, not just for the knowledge we acquire from the author's words, but for the intellectual vibrations those words set off in our own minds. In the quiet spaces opened up by the sustained, undistracted reading of a book, we make our own associations, draw our own inferences, foster our own ideas. Deep reading is indistinguishable from deep thinking," close quotes. Between Adorno and Horkheimer, Dreyfus and Carr, what students got was a massive intellectual assault on the liberatory capacities of film and television, the electronic media, and contemporary ways of communicating with each other. Also included was an essay by Sherry Turkle, which argued that Facebook, Instagram, and other ways of electronically connecting with each other actually increased loneliness, depression, and anxiety. By default, or in the case of Carr quite explicitly, quiet time with a good book, preferably something light by Plato or Pascal, was an unexceptionably good thing, especially if it is followed and reinforced by civilized conversation with other bookish selves. These bookish and Mandarin assaults on the reading habits and lack of concentration of the internet generation, to my surprise, did not offend students. They seemed to respond quite positively to the lyrically inflected nostalgia for a print-focused past. They lapped up the occasionally vicious denigration of current reading practices, or lack thereof. Was this some form of masochism, I wondered? More likely it had to do with the way university students constructed themselves as somehow different from their non-university peers, a difference that was being eroded even as it was conceived by the simultaneous spread of electronic media and the extension of higher education to larger and larger numbers. Still, reading appeared to have some residual cachet. Perhaps in a consumerist society, the value attributed to it increased as the practice itself slipped into desuetude. My long love affair with bookishness, however, was showing signs of strain. The course on the 3 kinds of selfhood, and especially the section on Frankenstein and the discussions around it, had already revealed something of the limitations inherent in the mere immersion in books. Don Quixote and Madame Bovary were also there as permanent reminders of the dangers of letting reading dominate one's life. Also, if you read enough about any topic, you will come up against theories that sharply contradict the theories that you first embraced without reserve. This may be the Hegelian dialectic in action, or it may be just what happens if you spend enough time burrowing into the same hole. At some point, you hit a rock. One of the unexpected consequences of exploring such topics as the bookish self and the nostalgic accounts of its erosion by newer forms of communication is that eventually one encounters arguments against the historical contingency, arguments about the historical contingency of such selves. The bookish self itself destroyed an earlier, presumably more orally mediated version of the self. As a character in Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris says, holding a book and looking at the great cathedral, this will destroy that. Print culture will destroy religious architecture as a symbol of belief and will perhaps destroy religious belief itself. Plato's Phaedrus explores the possibility that printed books will destroy the capacity for human memory, replacing valuable memories and knowledge with useless information. It is a kind of poetic justice that the bookish self, overcoming and displacing oral traditions, may have to yield to other versions of selfhood. It is with this thought in mind that I briefly contemplated calling this talk From the Grammatical to the Instagrammatical Self. Thus it was that at some point in my reading about reading, I found myself moving towards the disconcerting realization that reading itself constitutes a technology, a kind of work on the self that has liberatory as well as coercive implications. The bookish self is less innocent than it has been made out to be. Marshall McLuhan, Benedict Anderson, and Jack Goody, among others, have argued persuasively that the print culture of Europe that came into existence in the aftermath of Gutenberg's 15th century invention of the printing press was also responsible for the formation of modern nations with their proclivity for war and imperial expansion. More importantly, print culture, with its corollary consequence of the simultaneity of vast numbers of readers reading similar texts, is both the begetter of a capacious and solitary self and of a coordinated and tractable public, a seeming paradox that in its more general form has been thoroughly explored by a number of writers. Adorno and Horkheimer, in their bleak vision of the failed promise of Enlightenment thought, argue that, I quote, "The individual who supported society bore its disfiguring mark. Seemingly free, he was actually the product of its economic and social apparatus. Every advance in individuation took place at the expense of the individuality in whose name it occurred." Althusser and Foucault, in different ways, similarly undermine the notion of the autonomous and free individual. Adorno, Horkheimer, and Althusser, discussing the bourgeois individual in general terms, not the book-reading bourgeois individual specifically. Ian Watt's brilliant phenomenological description of the middle-class reader, however, reminds us that one of the sharpest weapons of the Enlightenment was the seemingly solitary and passive act of reading, and especially reading the novel, that great engine of secular unification. So here's what on reading. The impersonal authority of print is complemented by its capacity for securing a complete penetration of the reader's subjective life. The mechanically produced and therefore identical letters set with absolute uniformity on the page are, of course, much more impersonal than any manuscript, but at the same time, they can be read much more automatically. Ceasing to be conscious of the printed page before our eyes, we surrender ourselves entirely to the world of illusion which the printed novel describes. The effect is heightened by the fact that we are usually alone when we read, and that the book, for the time being, becomes a kind of extension of our personal life. Close quotes. How economically and accurately what captures the mixture of technological convenience and the extension of the intimate and private aspects of the self that a novel offers. It is no wonder that reading, understood as a phenomenological process, resists that other understanding of itself that emphasizes its role as a communal, collective, and disciplinary process akin to medieval praying together in a church or the counting of beads. Texts which deal with reading as a disciplinary protocol are surprisingly late on the scene. Perhaps this is an Owl of Minerva phenomenon associated with the fact that print culture is still too close to us to be seen with detachment. Harold Innis suggests that, I quote, "We are perhaps too much a part of the civilization that followed the printing industry to be able to detect its characteristics." Close quotes. Whatever the reason, print remained the dominant technology of communication for something like 5 centuries, only being seriously challenged in the mid-20th century by the advent of film and subsequently by the internet towards the very end of the 20th century. Lucien Febvre and Henri-Jean Martin's 1958 L'apparition du livre, The Coming of the Book, may be the first text in what is now the burgeoning field of book history, and 1958 is a very late date to be reviewing the effects of centuries of print. Febvre and Martin are also scholarly and tactful to the point of blandness. We are told that the printed book was one of the most potent agents at the disposal of Western civilization, but the demonstration of this is to be inferred rather than made. The same holds for Elizabeth Eisenstein's 1980, The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, perhaps the most extended and scholarly account of the influence of print on culture and thought. The really interesting early accounts are the less academically respectable, the more daringly generalizing ones by the Canadians Harold Innis and Marshall McLuhan. McLuhan, influenced by Innis, is one of the first to explore the links between reading and the coordinated power of industrialized nations. In his 1962 book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, McLuhan writes of the unwavering outlook, the almost hypnotized visual stance that print culture encourages. He goes on to argue in Foucauldian fashion that homogenization of men and materials will become the great program of the Gutenberg era, the source of wealth and power unknown to any other time or technology. Close quotes. Predating Benedict Anderson's imagined communities by 20 years, McLuhan argues not only that the uniformity and repeatability of the book created modern markets and the price system inseparable from literacy, but also that nationalism does not develop its full potential of uniform lateral extension until after the application of print technology to the methods of work and production. McLuhan often simply states rather than argues for something, but the claims he makes constitute a fascinating alternative to the perspective on the book as passive partner or catalyst in the project of autonomous self-creation. Books hypnotize us, he suggests plausibly, just as Watt suggests that we surrender ourselves entirely to the world of illusion that the novel encourages. Both authors emphasize the effects of uniformity and repeatability that print embodies. McLuhan takes more risks than Watt, arguing that print creates both modern markets and the price system, as well as nationalism itself. and it is perhaps too much to expect McLuhan to demonstrate this. But McLuhan, despite his generalizing, or because of it, grasps what many do not, that print may be part of the deep unconscious of Western power, that without books and the phenomenon of widespread literacy in Europe and its offshoots, there would be no empire, no world domination. Disciplined and docile subjects who people the modern nation and administer and benefit from empire emerge not only from drilling of the body and the principle of surveillance, as Foucault suggests, but more significantly from endless reading and the internalized self-surveillance that such reading brings about. The one feature of European print culture that escapes the attention of Watt and McLuhan is the significance of the simultaneity of the reading process. The fact that readers are reading the same books at the same time is of enormous importance. Benedict Anderson focuses much more closely on this simultaneity. His 1983 book laid out the influential thesis that modern nations were imagined communities, associations of men and women held together by their shared psychic participation in print culture, and especially in those two staples of modern mass communication, the novel and the newspaper. Anderson shares with McLuhan the sense of print culture as having a homogenizing and coordinating effect on the mass of readers, even as it individualizes them, but goes beyond McLuhan in his emphasis on the simultaneity of the reading process. In a famous passage, Anderson captures the remarkable relationship between nationalism and reading. I quote, "What more vivid figure for the secular, historically clocked, imagined community can be envisioned? At the same time, the newspaper reader, observing exact replicas of his own paper being consumed by his subway, barbershop, or residential neighbors, is continually reassured that the imagined world is visibly rooted in everyday life. Fiction seeps quietly and continuously into reality, creating that remarkable confidence of community in anonymity, which is the hallmark of modern nations." Close quotes. The crucial phrase here is "at the same time." The private, silent, simultaneous reading of novels and newspapers generates the public and often noisy rituals of nationalism. Famous readers who have hurled Richardson's Pamela across the room, or who have broken into angry tears at the protracted death of Little Nell and Dickens' The Old Curiosity Shop, are proof, if it were needed, of the stealthy generative movement of print from private emotion to public action. Kipling's British soldier in a story called The Janeites, who names 3 artillery pieces after characters in Jane Austen's novels, is also paying tribute to the interconnections between prose fiction and militant nationalism in a fashion that would have pleased the late Edward Said. Writers like McLuhan and Anderson suggest a counter-narrative to the one about cultured, bookish selves as a battered and sensitive minority sheltering against the storm of vulgarity and disconnected bits of information that seem to constitute the electronic media. Print seems to be a formidably double-edged weapon, conferring roomy interiority and freedom at the same time as it does conformity and passivity, stimulating independence even as it encourages docility. Edward Said's groundbreaking study of Orientalism brings some of these paradoxes into clearer view. He argues that Orientalism is, I quote, "the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, dealing with it by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it, by teaching it, settling it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient," close quotes. Said's text suggests that reading more and more of the same kind of book certainly generates power, but it also suggests that the kind of power generated is not necessarily conducive to the spread of equity or justice. In terms made familiar by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, such reading is a form of cultural capital that, like material capital itself, always tends towards a monopoly of power. It confers power on the readers and certainly also a sense of freedom and flexibility. However, it does this by encouraging these readers to recognize only themselves as free and independent, and to identify and segregate those who are to be exploited, largely by rendering them less than human, by placing them outside the charmed circle of the acceptably literate. Having discussed the dangers of a naive trust in the effects of literacy, I have to admit I still advise students to read printed books, and to read as many of them as they can. In Canada, the life of the mind is such a fragile entity, under assault as it has been by the spirit of pragmatism, by the technological imperative, and in the university itself by corporatism, that it seems incredibly reckless to simply turn our backs on 5 centuries of print culture, however complicit this culture has been in ideologies of the West's supremacy. I want to end by suggesting that we work hard to avoid 2 of the most seductive options presented to those who are concerned about either the disappearance of the deep reader and to those concerned about the complicity of reading itself in narratives of exploitation and coercion, and to those who, like myself, are paradoxically concerned about both. One option consists of the rush to embrace the brave new world of electronic media as a liberatory alternative to print culture, a move promoted by McLuhan in some moods. This move, to put it politely, is probably premature. He envisioned a global village of electronic communication, a space in which corporeal isolation is compensated for by speedy messaging and a strange sort of cyber Gemütlichkeit. Little that we have seen of the new world of electronic media indicates that McLuhan's optimism is justified. If anything, immersion in the electronic media can intensify ethnic and nationalistic hatreds and seems mainly to produce such masters of succinct Twitter prose as Donald Trump. The other option, brilliantly fleshed out by Roland Barthes, among others, suggests that reading against the grain, playfully, and with a writerly insistence on the reader's participation in the text, can retrieve the polymorphous perversity and jouissance of any and all texts. The docile reader that McLuhan and Anderson have posited can become, at a single stroke, the playful subversive who rereads, for instance, Said's Orientalist texts as a series of delightful and self-contradicting aporias and impasses. But if McLuhan's optimism about electronic media is misplaced, so is Barthesian optimism about the capacities and even motivations of readers. Barth's emphasis on technique is very much of a piece with what Jacques Ellul calls the technological society of our time. Avoiding the pitfalls of both McLuhan's airy optimism about the consequences of our saturation in electronic media and of a Barthesian faith in the writerly texts of the emancipated reader, we should, I will argue, continue to be disciplined readers of texts. We must, however, read and think more about how reading has historically shaped us, and we must read texts that take us out of our readerly comfort zones. What you read is at least as important as how you read, and changes how you read. As to how one reads, I'd like to put in a final plug, perhaps unexpectedly, for a kind of distracted reading rather than deep reading. The phrase I have used several times, the phenomenology of reading, suggests rather unfortunately a certain type of reader as ideal, the reader who reads closely, thoroughly, and continuously. As one who has never managed to read Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past or Sterne's Tristram Shandy all the way through, despite many attempts, I have to confess that this style of reading has always functioned for me more as an ideal to be aspired to than as an achieved practice. I would like to sing the praises, perhaps defensively, of a different phenomenology, one of distracted and promiscuous, but incessant and wide reading. In defense of such a reading style, I summon the spirits of Samuel Johnson, who proudly confessed he had never read a book through, but only the parts that appealed to him, and Walter Benjamin, who argued that to concentrate on a work of art is to be absorbed by it, but to respond to it distractedly is to absorb it. I want to propose that Johnson and Benjamin, very fine readers both, meant that partial and distracted reading broke the hypnotic trance of bookish power and introduced a more equitable and reciprocal relationship between reader and book. So in conclusion, if you have found your attention relentlessly straying while I have been speaking. I applaud your revolutionary distractedness and say quite cheerfully, mon semblable, mon frère. Thank you. I'm told we have some time for questions. I haven't been keeping an eye on the time, so 10 minutes? Yeah, okay. I have received the signal from Jana. If you have a question, you'll have to speak up a bit. I'm a bit hard of hearing. I see Teresa has her hand up there. I think there's a mic somewhere there, Teresa. You're not leaving, are you? Oh.
There.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I wanted to ask Nigel is, I like this idea of distracted reading. Although, you know, like you, I actually was, I was profoundly attached to
You
the
have to
idea of
speak up a
deep
bit.
reading.
A bit louder.
So I like this idea of distracted reading.
Ah.
Though I like the idea of deep reading too. It's an old idea, but if you think now in terms of the internet, like how distracted can distracted reading get?
Hmm.
I mean, at what point is it not useful?
Okay, that's a question I was actually dreading, because I moved to, you know, dissing the internet to advocating for a kind of distracted reading. And obviously I've done both. And I think most of us are, especially academics, are worried about the fact that their reading habits are being affected by the internet. So in response to what you suggest, I would still say print reading carries with it a kind of discipline and training that I wouldn't want to turn my back on. So the distracted reading is still within print, which is not to say you don't read stuff on the internet, you do. But from what I can make out, internet reading carries an inherent distractedness with it. You cannot help but be distracted. You scan, you do not read things right through, you just pluck out what's relevant. So I think what I'm suggesting is something in between, where perhaps you read a lot, or you read a lot of printed text, but you do not necessarily get sort of stuck. You don't get enslaved to the idea that you start a book and you read it right through and you finish it, which I think I was brought up to do and which really made me suffer, which was why it was such a liberation to read Samuel Johnson, who was working in a bookshop and used to just, as he said, he plucked out the heart of the book by looking at, you know, a few pages here, what was written on the back, what was written in front, so that he could tell someone in a minute or so what the book was about. So I like that kind of reading too. And I don't think you get the kind of necessary training in that kind of reading if you read all your material off the net. I think you have to apply it to print reading. I hope that was a
I just want to say that we have a number of individuals online, and if anybody online wishes to ask a question, you can type it into the Q&A or into the chat, and I will relay it for you. Or if you're interested in speaking, I can allow you to do that as well. Just let me know.
yeah, Marilyn? Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you, Madeline. I definitely don't think that reading is, a congenital skill. It's not genetic, it's not congenital. But on the other hand, I think what you're suggesting, and I think that's accurate, is that if you do not have an environment in which there are opportunities to read, then you won't read. So you probably have to be, or it benefits you to be born into a household where there are books everywhere and people actually read. They put aside quiet time to read. Otherwise, it's probably very unlikely that you will become a reader. So it's not congenital, it's not genetic, but it's hugely environmental. And I think I remember reading in some sociology texts that one of the ways in which the middle class retains its, its financial power is precisely by encouraging their kids to be good readers, to give them the opportunity to access books. And that would include things like, reading bedtime stories to children and having copies of Harry Potter on the house. So I think, to be sort of realistic about it, having books in the house and encouraging people to read almost inevitably produces readers. And the more variety, the better.
I have a question from
Brian? Sorry.
Professor Antonio Cancano. He would like to ask it himself. Tony, are you able to unmute your microphone now?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nigel, for that wonderful talk. I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I'm wondering about the conflict of pleasures. So the pleasure of the deep read and the pleasure of the shorter, quicker, more playful read that you suggest, and how should we negotiate these two pleasures? They seem to be in conflict sometimes. So I'm riffing off your idea of jouissance at the end of your talk.
Okay, could you just repeat the thing about the two pressures?
Pleasures. So there's a pleasure in the two types of reading.
Okay.
Right. And I'm wondering how one and they give and they do two different things to us, these kind of pleasures. And I'm wondering, is there how sometimes they come into conflict, right? And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how we can negotiate these two motivating pleasures of reading.
Okay, that's really interesting. If I can respond anecdotally, I think for someone in English, there is the very obvious pleasure in responding to narrative in a kind of wholehearted way. That is to say, I start a book and I cannot put it down. So I have no option but to yield to a pleasure of continuous reading. And the same kind of pleasure applies to, a movie which I'm enjoying or a television series which I binge over, 2 days. So that's one kind of pleasure. And there is another kind which I associate with reading, say, philosophy or sociology or economics, where, for one thing, the material is so difficult that I cannot read in a sustained way. So I am forced to browse and look for sections which make sense to me. So sometimes I will read the same section several times and I won't read entire chapters in another book. So I think what's happening there is I'm actually indulging two very different kinds of pleasure. One is almost addictive. It's a bit like Benjamin saying, when you when you sort of yield to the work of art, it absorbs you. So in that sense, I'm not really paying too much critical attention to what I'm reading, but I'm reading continuously. And the other pleasure is a more cool and detached pleasure where I am acquiring information and knowledge by browsing and pulling out just the things I want and not yielding to the pressure to read the text continuously and thoroughly. I hope that was in line with what you were asking about.
Yes, thank you very much, Nigel. That was very, very helpful. Thank you.
I have more online questions. The next one is from Peter Neary. Can the division between fiction and non-fiction survive the digital age?
I'm sorry, you might have to repeat that.
Can the division between fiction and non-fiction survive the digital age?
Could someone repeat that?
Fiction and non-fiction survive the digital age.
Oh, lovely one. I'm absolutely certain that fiction will survive the digital age, because the digital age does not actually challenge, especially film narrative and any narrative that is visual. So fiction will definitely survive. Non-fiction, that's an interesting thought. I do think that certain kinds of abstract thinking are suffering from the widespread absorption of electronic media, the widespread immersion in social media. This may just be me, but I think I've noticed a certain deterioration in the quality of abstract thought after the advent of the internet. So I don't think fiction is going to be affected, because fiction doesn't necessarily require a very high level of concentration, but feels like philosophy, political theory, economics, perhaps to some extent. I have a feeling, yes, it obviously is not going to put an end to them, but I think the quality of the thinking might very well deteriorate. Brian?
Can you hear me, Nigel?
Yeah.
Wonderful. First of all, thank you for your talk and congratulations to you. I don't know if this is a question exactly or more of a vague comment. I'm seizing on your recollection of this notion of imagined communities as something that emerges out of a practice reading that has become for us a very private and solitary thing. Typically, we have communities emerging. And I say this as somebody who is completely out of touch with social media. I laughed at your Instagram joke, but if you were to offer me $1,000 to tell you what Instagram is and how it's different from Facebook, I would have to pass on that. So I think this question is informed by some nostalgia on my part. In the era of social media and in the era of an increasingly fragmented culture, we still have very powerful imagined communities, but they are no longer communities that we think of in national terms or imperial terms, but they are much smaller and often much more fierce things. Do you have any thoughts at all on the imagined communities that have grown up around social media platforms like Facebook and so on?
Okay. That's actually something that's come up in some of the courses I teach, and I think you're right. I mean, imagined communities is when they refer to nationalism, when Benedict Anderson is talking about nationalism, are definitely print communities. And today's communities, which are emerging out of social media, are clearly not entirely print communities. And I think such communities as are emerging are going to be much more heterogeneous and fragmented than the older national communities. And in some ways, this is a good thing. It has to be a good thing. because nationalism, we were always taught and we always believed, was the source of war, among other things, and militant patriotism and ethnocentrism. So at one level, it seems plausible that the new imagined communities that are coming out of social media must be good. They must be less ethnocentric or less given to militant nationalism than earlier communities. But I'm not sure whether this is how it actually works. And one of the reasons I'm not sure is if you look at the whole Trump election, which for me personally was one of the most horrible things that has happened in recent history, there was very effective use of social media by Trump and his ideologues. There's also considerable evidence of hate groups and terrorist groups of various kinds flourishing as a direct result of social media. So I think it's up for grabs what kind of imagined communities are going to emerge from this shift between print media and media that owes more to electronic transfer. I don't think it's possible to say in a general kind of way that there is a trend towards some kind of improvement, which is a very McLuhan-esque notion, that we are definitely moving towards a global village. I think that's the surface impression that's given. I'm not at all sure that it's going to, inevitably lead to a beautiful utopian society where, as a result of our connectivity, we get rid of all the national tensions or the squabbles for land and so on and so forth. So I don't know if I got what you were asking. Yeah.
We have two more online questions. The next one is, how does the current popularity of group reading experiences like book clubs factor into your concept of reading as the creation of a self? This comes from Kate Crawford.
That is really interesting, because even as I was writing this paper, it occurred to me that one of the features of Victorian novels was that they were read aloud. Dickens was read in the parlor to the whole family. A little earlier in the 18th century, Addison's articles in the Spectator were read to the pub. People would go to the coffee houses and read out the entire essay. So there's always been a component of print culture that was oral and sociable. And what the question asked about book clubs, I think takes us to a similar niche response to books. And I say niche response because I think what is right, for most of us, reading is still fairly solitary. I don't know if I'm getting this wrong, but for me, it's always been a very private, quiet thing. You get away from other people and you curl up with your book and you come down to meals still reading and you are told not to read. So it's a sort of solipsistic world of the book. And I think book clubs and various organizations which encourage shared reading or a sort of communication with other readers while you're reading, I think they're somewhat anomalous. They're fairly widespread, but I think compared to the number of solitary book readers, I think the number is still quite small. Where they do exist and where they're successful, I'm fairly sure they change the way people read and respond to each other. But whether it's widespread or whether it can be widespread, I have my doubts about, because I think we are moving towards a more and more solitary and self-interested society. Everything seems to be pushing us towards becoming more alienated, more anomic, less engaged with each other.
And the final question online is, can you comment further on ideologies and reading?
The ideologies?
Yes, ideologies and reading.
Sorry, what was that? Oh, okay. Ideologies and reading. The main thrust of my talk was that between the 15th century invention of the printing press by Gutenberg and the middle of the 20th century, Europe absolutely almost monopolized printing and reading. This is not in itself a bad thing, but it led to a concentration of power. And I think it also led to a repetition of the ideology of European supremacy. I think this was inevitable. I think if any group of people occupies something like an echo chamber in which they don't hear alternative accounts of their reality, they start to believe what they are hearing. So I think, and this is something Scythe draws our attention to, increasingly, especially after the 18th century, 18th, 19th, early 20th, Europe starts to repeat narratives about the superiority of Europe and the strangeness and alienness of other parts of the world, the oddness, the savagery, the primitivism of Africa, of India, of South America, of China, of every part of the world that's not European. So eventually it becomes ideological in the sense that it feeds into power, and that power feeds into the narrative that is generated by print. So it becomes self-enclosed. And this is so powerful that I think it takes right up to the middle of the 20th century, 1940s, 1950s, for that situation to start to be changed, because that's when people start writing and publishing against European hegemony. People get PhDs from universities in the States or England or Europe and start writing books which challenge European history. So reading and ideology obviously go together. And what is really interesting is what happens to ideology when reading and writing become more culturally heterogeneous. People start reading and writing from every part of the world, and monolithic structures of Western hegemony start being challenged. So ideologically, what I'm suggesting is that, in fact, the more variety in the reading you do, the more likely that there will be equity and distribution of power. The ideology of the monolithic print culture has increasingly been challenged, and it can only be a good thing when that monolithic structure is broken down. I think we are done with questions. I've been asked to ask you to stay put, not go, just for about a minute or so, because there has to be some kind of technology shift taking place. So please remain in your seats for a minute. And thank you very much for being so attentive and for asking me such challenging and stimulating questions.
Good afternoon. On behalf of my family, I want to thank King's for putting together today's event. The Christopher Perrin Beatty Lecture was established in 2012 in honor of my brother who died from a motorbike accident in Thailand in 2008. The lecture was set up to recognize outstanding teaching faculty at King's. While Christopher was only 23 years old at the time of his death, he lived a big life for someone his age, with family, friends, debate, and politics at its center. As with many other students, professors had a key role in both his academic and personal development. Many of his professors left an indelible imprint on his life and had fostered a passion for intellectual pursuits. Christopher wanted to leave a mark on his community and country, but unfortunately, he didn't get enough time to fully realize that potential. That's why this lecture series means so much to my family and me. We're tremendously grateful for King's College for their support keeping my brother's memory alive by showcasing outstanding teachers that are making an impact on their students' lives. When we were younger, my mother Julia used to tell my brother and I that great teachers really make all the difference. When we were picking our courses at the beginning of the academic year, she would say, if you have an interesting subject with a bad teacher, it's going to be a bad course. But if you have a dry subject with a great teacher, it's going to be a great course. It's clear from reading his students' reviews online that our honoree and lecturer today truly embodies that philosophy. One student wrote of him, even if you go into his class dreading political theory, you'll love it by the end. Another said that he makes even the driest topics seem interesting and makes difficult concepts easy to understand. That sounds like a truly outstanding professor to me, which is why it's my great pleasure to introduce today's honoree, Associate Professor Dr. John Grant, who is this year's recipient of the King's Award of Excellence in Teaching for Full-Time Faculty. Professor Grant has a distinguished educational background, boasting a BA from Wilfrid Laurier, an MA from Queen's, and a PhD from the University of London. His academic interests are modern and contemporary political theory, the history of political thought, and Canadian politics with a particular focus on critical theory, democratic theory, and political ideologies. Professor Grant teaches 6 courses at King's, including Introduction to Political Science, Introduction to Political Theory, Inequality and Violence, Freedom, Order, and Control, Postmodern Political Theory, and Elites and Power. And he's written 2 books, Lived Fictions, Unity and Exclusion in Canadian Politics, and Dialectics in Contemporary Politics, Critique and Transformation from Hegel through Post-Marxism. And to top off his clearly very open schedule, he also serves as the co-editor at the Journal of Contemporary Political Theory. His lecture today is titled, When Students Build a Political Theory Hall of Fame, Some Reflections. Professor Grant, congratulations on your award, and thank you for agreeing to speak with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Perrin and Julia, and the entire Beatty family for supporting teaching excellence here at King's and giving us the honor of continuing Christopher's memory here on campus. Before I invite John to the podium, Nigel, I'm embarrassed to say how many books I have in my house that are half read. I hope maybe retirement, I'll actually finish them. So thank you very much for your talk. It was really daunting and inspiring at the same time. Before we hear Dr. Grant's, where are you done? There you are. I would like to present you with the award officially. So if you could join me over here. All right, congratulations. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by thanking the Beatty family Julia, Perrin, and Patrick for their generosity of spirit. The Beatty support multiple awards at King's, including this one for teaching excellence, and we all benefit from their ongoing commitment to our university. I'm going to pause and get this up higher. Oh, that's much better. This is the first time I've seen almost any of you in 20 months. One reason for which we all have sympathy is the pandemic. Another reason is that since January this year, I've been on sabbatical, something that probably generates much less sympathy. Either way, it's very good to be here in person with you today. Given that we're here for teaching awards, I'm going to speak about an activity I conduct twice per year in my second year Introduction to Political Theory course. It runs from September to April and introduces students to some of the major thinkers and controversies in political theory. We start by studying ancient approaches with particular focus on Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And then we move to the moderns and familiar names such as Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Federalists, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and John Stuart Mill. But the course has changed every year I teach it. Immanuel Kant and Thomas Aquinas faced the chopping block years ago in the face of student indifference, while Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, and Mill only receive 1 week of study compared to their original 2 weeks. I've filled these openings with the English feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, the Black American theorist and activist W.E.B. Du Bois, the Gananoque Mohawk scholar Tyaki Alfred, and the American feminist Nancy Fraser. Next semester, the French revolutionary feminist Olympe de Gouges and the Haitian revolutionary Toussaint Louverture will appear for the first time in the course. But the reading list skews male, and it always has. I populated the course from day one with contemporary feminist scholarship that rereads primary course texts from a gendered perspective. We do this for almost every one of the male theorists we study. And I point this out now because it will become consequential later on. The game I play in class with my students is called, and I could make this longer, but I think it's long enough, the Master Nouns of Political Theory Hall of Fame game. We play in December as a way to end the semester on a fun note, and again in April as part of final exam study prep. Here's how it goes. I stand up at the blackboard and students create a list of as many consequential terms as they can remember from the readings and lectures and debates. In each semester, we end up with at least 40 terms up on the board. Here's a visual representation of what that can look like. And it's a reminder for all the students how much they've covered and what we've discussed. So this is just a partial representation behind you of what the board can look like. But that's the easy part of the game. Next, students have to create their Hall of Fame. And I remind them that any Hall of Fame worth that name has to be exclusive. Not any old concept can walk in off the street. Otherwise, the result would be a political theory community center, not a real Hall of Fame. So to be included, a term needs significant support. About 75% of students in the class have to give their support, though it's often a lot higher than that. Election to the Hockey Hall of Fame and the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame requires nominees to receive at least 75% support from voters. The National Football League is 80%. In our case, sometimes multiple votes are required to determine the fate of a particular term. This usually happens when there are different options that serve a similar purpose, such as choosing between ethics and virtue or equality and inequality. There are two ways we get to the final list of terms in the Hall of Fame. Students can make a case for a particular term to be included. They have to explain why that term is so significant that it should be celebrated and placed in the hall. Or students can do the opposite. They can explain why a term is perhaps important, but still nonetheless less significant than others, why it doesn't do enough work to merit inclusion and should be crossed off the list. As an initial sample, I'm going to show you the winners from the first Hall of Fame game from 2014-2015. You can see the winning terms behind me, but I'm going to say them out loud anyway because they're words I enjoy saying. Justice, power, constitution, the good, citizenship, natural law, reason, rights, sovereignty, liberty, and class. The first 7 terms, up to and including reason, were selected in the December part of the game, and the final 4 terms in the April version. It's a decent Hall of Fame. It's slightly bloated, as you'll see, compared to subsequent years. Nonetheless, definitely not one that satisfied any subsequent group of students. The game usually takes about an hour to play, and obviously the action happens during the debate portion when students become advocates. Over the years, a number of consistent tensions have emerged in the lines of thinking that students deploy. And I want to refer to them now so that you have them in mind when I compare the different Halls of Fame. First, there's a tension between giving more weight to the historical record, that is, how certain ideas have shown up over periods of time, or whether the needs and concerns of contemporary politics should be included in how we make use of the past. Second, there's a tension between selecting broader catch-all terms or ones that are narrower and more specific. Third, there's a tension between prioritizing terms that name an ideal compared to those that name a problem to be solved. And finally, I'll have a few things to say about why class and especially gender struggle to be included. Every April, as soon as a class completes their Hall of Fame, I add their choices to an existing PowerPoint slide that contains all the previous Halls of Fame. Obviously, this is going to stop working in a few years when your normal PowerPoint slide no longer can accommodate all of these terms. But up until now, and thanks to the pandemic ruining one year, everything still fits on one slide. And then I show the students at that very moment how their Hall of Fame compares to the previous years. So let's go through that process together now. Students always gasp when they see that justice shows up first across every single year and every group of students that has played the game. The reason it does is because we read the trial of Socrates and debate whether or not he was treated justly. And then we follow Socrates with Plato's Republic, the central concern of which is how to organize a just political state. And there's never any pushback against the inclusion of justice. It's just a unanimous vote without much debate. Power. The inclusion of power also occurs without any serious objections. The key thinker here is Machiavelli, who helped inaugurate the modern tradition of realpolitik. He defined power as the capacity to compel other people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. Not all students like Machiavelli, far from it, but they realize that his influence is undeniable and that it is impossible to understand politics without an understanding of power. Next, we have constitution across the board, except for the 2020 class, which chose the state. Aristotle is decisive here, thanks to his typology of regime types such as monarchy and tyranny, aristocracy and oligarchy, and so on. Aristotle also teaches that understanding your country requires that you understand the spirit of its constitution. This is a point that students appreciate, even if it doesn't send them running away to read their copy of the charter, which I'm sure they all have. Interestingly, a few tensions show up at this point. Some students think that the term constitution is an overly broad catch-all term. They'd rather name a specific regime type. Democracy is the one that they push the most because of what it means to us today. But these students never come out on top. It's always the more general term constitution that wins the day. As I bring up the next row of terms, you're going to see that the initial consistency across years begins to decline. We start getting greater variation regarding which terms are chosen, as well as the order in which they appear. What shows up most obviously in this row, yes, this row, are three related terms: the good, virtue, and ethics. Ethics appears twice. This is the influence of the ancients again, particularly their view that successful leadership and simply the way we lead our own lives must be driven by a set of virtues. For example, in Plato, we're introduced to virtues such as wisdom, moderation, and courage. Even though these aren't words that set classroom debates on fire, the proper role of virtue is one that students find very contentious. The Machiavellians in the room think that successful politics only requires the correct application of power in a purely instrumental sense, and that virtues are simply window dressing. Others contend that the use of power must be directed by virtue, otherwise power will become a tool for self-interest and a source for corruption. There's typically enough agreement, however, that virtue or the good, or in some cases ethics, deserve a place in the hall. Let's investigate the next row of terms. We see here that sovereignty appears on the scene. This occurs thanks to the social contract theorists, especially Thomas Hobbes. He directed his readers to imagine the signing of a social contract. Participants would agree to a binding set of terms that would initiate the creation of the state and specify the nature of its relations with citizens. By sovereignty, Hobbes meant supreme political authority, independent and unlimited by any other power. There are many different versions of sovereignty, from the control of an absolute monarch to government by the people. As a result, the word sovereignty is like an essential placeholder where a battle then plays out regarding the details of political rule. Notice that human nature appears in 2020 and 2019, and now it shows up in 2018 and 2017 as well. This suggests increasing unanimity, except that human nature is one of the most divisive terms that we debate. On the one hand, we have students who rightly point out that human nature is discussed to one extent or another by most of the thinkers we study. On the other hand, we have students who recognize that none of these thinkers agree on what human nature is. Some students take an additional step to argue that the very idea of human nature seems like an awfully convenient tool, one that thinkers use to justify their preferred type of government. And in this sense, it is used, the idea of human nature is used in a somewhat underhanded way. In 2020, I had a student email me the following. This was after the December game was played. Quote, "I was so annoyed that everyone else was adamant on including human nature instead of other terms I thought were much more important." End quote. Notice what was left out of that year in December. No constitution, no virtue, no ethics. In the next row, liberty finally makes an appearance. Sometimes students want to be more specific by naming a particular kind of liberty. Liberty as non-interference, liberty as non-dependence, or liberty as self-mastery, or as a mutually beneficial social relationship. This never succeeds because those students are always outvoted by those who simply want the single term. Still, this kind of debate reinforces a more important lesson. Most of the words we see up here are what we can call empty signifiers. They don't have any intrinsic natural meaning. Instead, we advocate for our preferred meaning through philosophical and political debates. And this is no academic exercise. In politics, if you can control the dominant meaning of a term like liberty, your politics is more likely to appear as common sense, as the natural way of doing things. I think this is what motivates some students. The word liberty alone isn't enough. They want to choose what they think is the best kind of liberty because they see the political payoff if they're able to specify a more precise version of the term. I'm going to reveal the remaining choices now all at once so I can bring up some additional issues. Notice how equality appeared as the second last term in 2016. It was replaced by inequality in the 3 subsequent years. This is an example of the tension between naming an ideal, equality, versus naming a problem to be addressed, inequality. Why the shift? I've always assigned Rousseau's discourse on the origins of inequality, the popularity of which has skyrocketed in about the past 10 years. When I was an undergraduate, first encountering political theory in the 1990s, I never knew this text existed. It wasn't taught in my political science department, and I didn't encounter it until well into grad school. Its popularity has increased if you look at the number of texts that are have been written about this one, about Rousseau's work, and the number of times it's been cited. Its popularity has increased more or less in response to real growth in inequality this century. My students seem very aware of this phenomenon, the increase in inequality. They see it in the press and they raise it during class discussion. I think it's an example of our contemporary scene reflecting back on the history of political thought, directing students to pick out an issue, even though historically we don't see it show up as often as something like liberty or class or constitution. There are, however, some potentially unwelcome consequences that accompany the shift to inequality in these halls of fame. Notice how the term class was included in 2015 and 2016, then dropped out the same year that inequality was selected. Purely on the basis of the historical record, far more thinkers we read discuss class than discuss inequality explicitly. And most of them discuss class at length. If I was to list the names, it would include every primary source on the syllabus. The arguments about class are also wonderfully varied. The American Federalists claim that class divisions are impossible to eradicate, but luckily, according to them, they aren't really a serious problem. Adam Smith also thinks that it is impossible to eradicate class distinctions, although he concedes that they are problematic. And then there's Marx, who regards class divisions as terrible blights on society, but unlike the others, he argues that they can be eliminated. Despite the consistent focus on social classes, students tend to decide that the term inequality functions as a beneficial catch-all that includes class. Some regard inequality as a radical term because it's potentially so capacious. So why not use a word that has the widest possible implications? Others object to using a general term like inequality because it allows people to ignore class if they want to. This dodge is a popular move among our politicians, most of whom rely on a discourse that tends to avoid using either term, class or inequality, in any meaningful way. Politicians are unlikely to speak pointedly about class. Instead, they usually invoke it in reference to some amorphous middle class, which they seem to think includes about 85% of the population. A similar problem occurs with inequality. It is invoked generically, even politely, without naming the economic processes or class interests that are bound up with it. This tiptoeing around core political debates is something that my students happily dismiss, including when it comes to issues of gender. As I mentioned earlier, my students and I discuss the gendered nature of political theory, starting with Plato and moving through virtually all primary source thinkers. Gender is always included on our initial list of terms. Why does it so rarely make the next step into a Hall of Fame? The preference for the term inequality as a catch-all is part of the explanation. Inequality is presumed by some students to imply gender inequality. Another point that inevitably comes up is that the thinkers we read don't actually use the term gender itself. They write about man and woman in the universal singular. They write about men and women plural. Masculinity and femininity are also discussed, although again, the terms themselves are not necessarily used. But certainly the word gender is more or less absent in many of the classic texts. To which other students will respond, so what? The idea of gender is there. It structures the social organization that theorists advocate for, as well as the roles they assign to us as individuals, roles which are inevitably gendered. This is a strong point to make. Yet opponents have another move to play. They will contend that the magnitude of gender inequality today is reduced compared to the past. Of course, Aristotle and Hobbes and Locke favored men, but the issues women face today are receding because of feminism's achievements. The argument will continue on to concede how our society still has work to do regarding gender inequality, but that this doesn't mean gender merits a place in the Hall of Fame. Almost always, the arguments against gender win out. Inevitably, I get asked every year by students how I would change their Hall of Fame. My answer is always the same, that it belongs to them, and so I wouldn't change a thing. Although, if I was to give a more substantive answer, leaving aside class and gender for the moment, I would discuss two other terms with them, revolution and race. The issue of political revolution appears constantly in the history of political thought. It's there in Plato when he discusses why certain constitutions or regime types will decay and be replaced by different ones. Obviously, Marx has a few points to make about revolution, though sometimes more about how capitalism is the most revolutionary form of social organization that has ever existed, and less than is expected about the proletariat as a revolutionary class. But revolution also shows up in work by liberals and Republicans. In the 20th century, liberals became pretty squeamish about revolution, but this wasn't the case in the 17th century for John Locke or in the 18th century for Thomas Jefferson, who regarded revolution as a legitimate option available to anyone subjected to a long train of abuses from their government. As for race, I think its chances of making it into the Hall of Fame are going to increase in future years. Part of the reason it hasn't made it in so far has to do with me. My graduate training and subsequent teaching has always foregrounded issues of gender and feminism, so it made sense for me to make it a consistent theme throughout this course. For years, I felt like I couldn't do justice to the gendered readings of the classics and do the same for issues of race that show up too. One of my solutions has been to offer a third-year seminar called Inequality and Violence, the second half of which is devoted to Black political thought. Nevertheless, 2 years ago, I decided to add W.E.B. Du Bois into my Intro to Theory course, the one we're talking about today. My students found his work on racial consciousness and racial economics captivating. If I can do a better job of stitching together themes of race from Tyaki Alfred to Toussaint Louverture to Du Bois, race will start to figure in the course in a way that it hasn't yet up to this point. But even so, when it comes to the Hall of Fame, students may still decide that inequality remains the preferable catch-all term, like they tend to do with gender. I'm going to conclude by saying one or two more things about gender and its place in relation to the Hall of Fame. You might have noticed that in 2019, gender was included in the Hall of Fame. I even put an exclamation point beside it there to draw your attention to that. This was the result of the most contentious debate my students have ever had at any moment this game has been played. One half of the class, made up mostly of women, but also some men, insisted that gender be included. The other half, made up mostly of men, but also some women, argued to the contrary. Now, normally this stalemate would have resulted in a failed nomination because gender had about 50% support in this instance. But unlike in previous years, advocates for the inclusion of gender wouldn't stop talking about it. They refused to accept defeat, and they continually brought the debate back to gender and they simply would not let the game end. Then, without any prior planning, I did something unprecedented in that version of the game. As the Hall of Fame's chief theory officer, I declared that the nomination of gender had passed, despite not reaching the normal threshold of support. Well, what happened next? The class erupted. Advocates threw their arms in the air and cheered. The opposition slumped in their chairs and looked at each other as if a grave injustice had just been inflicted upon them. One student even launched an appeal on procedural grounds, which, as the chief theory officer, I simply overruled, and we carried on. To this day, I wonder how many of my students recognize the way in which that moment of classroom politics mimicked the quote unquote real thing. In short, change that year depended on a dedicated group making a demand and asserting every ounce of their power by refusing to let the demand be defeated. In this case, as in many cases, there was also an intervention by a person with considerable authority. However, my action depended on the unyielding commitment of those students to what they thought was right. The drama I have been describing captures a dynamic that emerges every year in this class. We can treat political theory as a game, but it always turns out to be much more than that. Thank you very much. I would like to point out that there are 3 of my previous students, all of whom have graduated, decided to come today. 2 of them are still here. And I believe at least one of them was part of the class where gender was included. Is that right, Mark?
Yeah, I was there.
Yeah, Mark was there. Is my account accurate, do you think?
Yeah, it was groundbreaking. I mean, I can't remember what side I was on. Fortunately, I want to say I was on the opposite side, but I do remember the eruption when you did write the term on the board.
Yeah, so the term would be on the board, and then to signal its inclusion in the Hall of Fame, I put a set of square brackets around it, and sometimes an asterisk to indicate its importance, rather than just drawing a line through it, which happens to most other terms. So thank you for being here and verifying my account, Mark. Yes, please. I can, yeah.
Nobody online can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, very well.
So I'm wondering about the composition of political science departments. And honestly, it's of your students. Like, could these terms be, in part, they get on the Hall of Fame for any particular year, because, for instance, gender doesn't show up because maybe you don't have as many people who see themselves as gendered. That is, people who feel that they're oppressed by their gender. Could it possibly be that race isn't turning up, even though you have readings of race, because you don't have a lot of people in the classroom who see themselves as raced, but see whiteness as a default of some kind. So I'm just wondering if the game is a little bit dictated by the people in the room and their life experiences.
Thank you. So obviously part of my answer has to agree with you that yes, there's no doubt that the nature of all the unique individuals in the classroom will contribute something important to what terms they choose. Of course, I think I'm probably, I'll speak for on behalf of some of my colleagues when I say that many of us hope that the readings we assign and the discussions that we have will prompt our students to step out of the sphere of their own subjectivity and maybe see things somewhat differently. And it's certainly something that I try and do in that class when it comes to gender. And although so far I've been speaking in a way which may make it seem like the discussion of gender is only intended to inform people of the historical subordination of women compared to men, what I point out and what many of the secondary source readings point out is that there are many limitations imposed upon men by assumptions of genders as well as on women as well. And so I try and what I try to do in the class is point out to men that the gendered components of political theory are affecting them in profound ways as well, and that there are a number of gendered power hierarchies that are sometimes implied but sometimes explicit depending on who we're reading. But there's no doubt that sometimes just the very nature of the class list will potentially, influence things one way or another. I don't know, when I look back at certain classes at the end of the year and how, the different students that were in the class and then compare to what terms they chose, it's hard for me to tell sometimes how much of a difference it made, because some years you could say, oh, well, there seems to be a correlation, but other times there doesn't seem to be. And whether that's down to how I teach the course that year or what the students are taking away from it, I wish I knew.
We have a question online from Christopher Roney. The question is, very interesting exercise. I am pondering how different these might look for students in different parts of the world, even based on the same readings. Even the US would likely differ. Do some of these strike you as being more appealing to Canadian students particularly?
Hi, Chris. Let's see. Yes, well, different readers in different parts of the world would bring different sensibilities to reading these texts. And so to a certain extent, a more general term like inequality might give way to race very easily if we were reading it somewhere else. I could see that happening. But I also don't want to discount the power that can be possessed by a formal term. So sometimes students will be worried about or dissatisfied by some of the assumptions a particular thinker makes, but they're nonetheless moved by the importance of some of the key terms that thinker will use. So this is probably the best example of that is liberty. That liberty gets spoken about by many modern thinkers as a universal value that should be enjoyed by all. Of course, then when we read around this in Hobbes or in Rousseau, we discover that in fact they don't necessarily apply their thoughts about liberty to everybody equally. It doesn't apply to women equally, and it doesn't apply to non-white racialized people equally either. But nonetheless, students are able to take the formal power of the argument, and although we always want to historicize the people we're reading, there is something powerful about dehistoricizing it as well. And by saying this idea of liberty as being equal and applicable to all is powerful and worthwhile, even outside of the context in it was written, because it means something for us here today. And so I wonder if there would be I think there would still be a certain amount of overlap between the terms that students choose here in London and what students would choose in other parts of the world, because there would be something of an appreciation of the formal power of some of these terms. Thanks, Chris.
I have a question here from Omar Garcia. The question is, hi, John, wonderful talk. Thanks so much. Does the staying power of any one term over the years surprise you? And do you think this reflects something about the perennial character of certain questions and problems in political thought?
Hi, Omar. Omar is a former student of mine here at King's. I had him for 1 year. In my first year, he was in his 4th year, and he's now well into his PhD at the University of Toronto in political theory. And I hope I'm not embarrassing Omar by saying he's one of the students who, when he would come to office hours, if I was having a tired day or an off day, I would have to pull up my socks good and quick, because he would ask me questions that I would often have to, well, I would have to work very, very hard to answer for him. As for the phenomenon of certain terms showing up again and again, and whether this indicates a staying power and a certain amount of consistency in the history of political thought, the answer is yes. And then what we do, of course, is that, as I said earlier, most of these, so let's take justice as an example. Justice is the epitome of an empty signifier, right? Because if I say to you, we need justice on a particular issue, you may agree, but unless we also follow up and say, unless I follow up and say, oh, and by the way, what does justice on this issue mean to you? And we don't have that discussion, then in fact, we haven't actually agreed on anything. All we've agreed upon is that there's a term that we like using, but we don't know what the actual implications of that agreement are. And so I think what's interesting about the history of political thought is that one of the ways it can be read historically is as, I don't want to say a totally continuous attempt to redefine these terms, because sometimes that history is discontinuous and terms fall out of favor and come back again. But it's nonetheless the case that a term like justice or a term like liberty, that these have been around for thousands of years, and what people do is commit themselves to convincing others that their understanding of the term is best. Because when you can do that in public, you now have the public on your side. And at least for certain views of politics, that's what you need. Other views of politics, you can get away with not having the public on your side. But we don't generally call those democracies. Thank you, Omar. Yes.
When you talked about introducing people like Tayaki Alfred and Mary Wollstonecraft, Olympe de Gouges, and I forget, Du Bois into your canon, you're changing the way in which your students receive what is thought of as classic political theory. Do you find that any of this comes back in your courses in future years? That is, when your year 2 students go into year 3 and year 4, and you're teaching them, do you notice that these sources are being used, or have they changed the texture of student responses in your upper year courses?
Yes, they have. So one of the student comments that Patrick alluded to in his video was that I seem to have the capacity to take a dry topic that some students dread and turn it into something that is at least moderately interesting. And I think what I see when students take my third and fourth year theory courses is that they don't show up, presuming they've taken my second year course, which most of them have already. They show up not wanting something entirely different from what we studied in the second year course, but they bring certain things that they've learned and certain sensibilities that they've cultivated over the duration of that second year course and begin applying them in the more senior courses. So one of the things I do sometimes as an icebreaker in one of the third or fourth year courses is I'll check to see how many students I know have already taken the second year course, and sometimes it's all of them. And I'll say, well, I've had a class with every one of you before at least once. You've all taken Intro to Political Theory. Who's your favorite person we read in that course, and why does that person stick with you? And every single person has a sophisticated answer. And my biggest challenge is to get them, is to have them not talk for a full hour of reflecting on the second year class. And so things stick with them in ways that I always find incredibly gratifying and inspiring. And in fact, if I can tell a really quick anecdote, I had to get my license plates replaced a couple of weeks ago. They were peeling, and I went down to the Service Canada office, and I waited my turn, and I walked up to the desk, and this young man said to me, "I can't tell because you're wearing a mask, but are you the John Grant that teaches at King's?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I had you in political theory 6 or 7 years ago." And I said, "Oh, great." And we started chatting. And he said, "As a matter of fact, I thought of you a couple of weeks ago because I was listening to a podcast, and one of the guests on the podcast mentioned John Rawls's idea of a veil of ignorance. And you didn't explain it very well, but I knew exactly what was going on because I'd read about it with you in class." And that was 7 years ago. And so to me, it was an example of how students actually, sometimes when I reflect on my undergraduate degree, I lament how much I don't remember. But it seems that at least for a period of time, at least 7 years, they're remembering a certain amount. And so this is, I think, to maybe say something a little more substantive about your question. The reason why I think it's so important for me to make the changes to the syllabus I'm making is precisely because the students carry it on. And I want to see them carrying on different things than I carried on when I took Intro to Political Theory in the 1990s.
Okay, we have several, not sure how much time we have. I'll just ask questions. We have several questions online, and until somebody tells me to stop, I'll just keep asking them. So this comes from Natalie Lario. Thank you, Dr. Grant, and congratulations on a well-deserved award. I'm glad I got to hear one of your lectures again. You touched on the appearance of inequality on the Hall of Fame list and how this could be related to environmental factors such as media and news. Do you ever forecast the list of terms or notice a difference in the definition of empty signifiers based on what is going on outside the classroom?
Hi, Natalie. Nice to hear from you, and thanks for joining us. It can be sometimes hard to tell, but I think that inequality is the most obvious example of this, because I don't have, other than the fact that I assign Rousseau's discourse on inequality, I think the environmental factor that you allude to in this case is quite telling, that students read about inequality and hear about it so often that this prompts them to want to include it. it also suggests to me that, students are reading news in some way or another, and news that includes material about social inequality and economic inequality. As for other terms, let me look at my list. One term that had acquired a much different inflection a couple of years ago was sovereignty, and this was in the context of Brexit. All of a sudden, students were talking about sovereignty in a way that they had never talked about before. And I even ended up assigning one of the options, one of the essay questions that students could choose was to write an essay about Thomas Hobbes and whether he would have been pro-Brexit or anti-Brexit, and use his conception of sovereignty to explain where he would have sat on this issue. So I think that's another, probably one of the more recent examples of how the broader political environment influences how students are understanding and responding to how they're reading the history of political thought.
Next question comes from Peter Neary. He asks, does your course include Canadian political thinkers?
This course doesn't. No, this is a history of political thought from Socrates up until the early 20th century, but then with all sorts of secondary source texts that have been written, from over the past 2 or 3 decades. And there are, I think, maybe 1 or 2 Canadian-based secondary sources, but all the primary source texts are historical and non-Canadian. There is, of course, I suppose, we do read Tyaki Alfred in an important essay that he wrote called Sovereignty. He belongs to, he's a Mohawk who was born in Gananoque, and he's a very radical political thinker, and I'm pretty certain that he doesn't regard himself as a Canadian because he doesn't regard the Canadian state as a legitimate state. And so some people, so technically he is living in a place that that most of us call Canada, but he doesn't. And so I wouldn't classify him for that reason as a Canadian, as an example of a Canadian political theorist.
And here's the last question. This comes from Professor Antonio Calcagno. Hi, John. Thanks for your talk. I really enjoyed it. Other political traditions question, even critique, the idea of liberal equality as a pivotal, archaic, Hall of Fame concept. For example, Italian feminist and Latinx political thinkers seek self and group realization, self and collective becoming as a primary category for politics and political solidarity. My question, does equality run the risk of being too abstract and flattening as an arche for politics?
Thank you, Tony. I can always count on Tony to complicate things right at the end. Yes, so I think the word equality does run that the risk of flattening and being imprecise, and for its advocates of failing to name what they think equality demands and requires. And so this is something we try and push one another to do in this course and in all my political theory courses, is to give texture and substance to these terms. So when we, for example, in my third-year course, Freedom, Order, and Control, we at a certain point in the semester have 6 or 7 different competing versions of liberty. And so at that point, for anyone to make a comment about liberty without specifying what type of liberty, it becomes an unhelpful and even useless appeal because nobody knows what it means anymore. You have to give it the texture and substance of one of the more precise understandings. So the risk is always there, Tony, that almost any of these terms, but especially something like equality, can be used too generically and without enough precision to make it do the hard work that we need it to. Thank you. Good, thanks.
Thank you again. I have to lower this. You're a little taller than I am. Thank you again, Dr. Grant, and thank you, Dr. Joseph, and congratulations again to you both. I'm Jana Gordon, Executive Director of Alumni and Development here at King's. On behalf of the King's University College Foundation, I would like to thank the Beatty family for making the Christopher Perrin Beatty Lecture possible, and thank King's University College for making the part-time faculty lecture possible. Thank you to all of you who have attended this afternoon. This concludes this year's event. Have a wonderful evening.